I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Ali and Wendy for the invitation and your hospitality, and to everyone for being here. I think I'm going to present a research project that's still, the project is finished, but the analysis is still in progress. So you have a sneak peek at a small case study project that took place in Quebec. It's about, and there's a lot of themes that tie into what we've seen this morning. So I'm looking forward to the discussion after. Informal social support during the transition from childcare to school, mapping children's, mothers, and educators' experiences and perspectives is the title. I'll just go through the presentation. So you know that transition practices can facilitate children's transition. In Quebec, we have childcare that goes up to age 5, and then most of the children in Quebec start school at age 5 when they have to turn 5 before September 31st. Some of the children don't attend childcare; they go straight to school from a home setting, and some children start school at age 4, but that's a small percentage at the moment. So transition practices can be helpful, and research on the transition has found that although formal transition practices have been documented, there are also lots of informal transition practices that parents really appreciate. Things like they lose that connection with the educator, and they're stuck behind the gate waiting for their children at the end of the day because they're not allowed into the school. But then in that setting, they develop an informal network with all the parents. So when they have questions or how does school work, and they're not getting the communication that they need from the school, they end up doing it amongst the parents themselves. And there's little research on whether that same type of informal network could happen amongst children. So what I did was, there was a mother at one child care center who I'll tell you a little bit about the transition practice that she organized later, but she was organizing this transition practice, and I said, oh, hey, that sounds really interesting. I would like to come and observe it, document it. So the aim was really to map parent, child, and educator experiences and perspectives during a parent-initiated transition practice, which was designed to establish informal support networks amongst children and parents. And I had a sneak peek at the Scottish Early Childhood, Children and Families Transition Position Statement. And I decided what I wanted to do with this data was map the findings onto the transition practice, the transition statement. In Quebec, we don't have a transition position statement. I know they have one in Australia, and there's some others around the world. We have a guide written by the Ministry of Education in conjunction with the Ministry of Social Services and Health and the Ministry of Family, who's in charge of the early childhood sector, with 6 principles of what a successful transition to school should look like. It's not a bad document, but it was published in 2010, so 9 years ago now. I would say it's a bit outdated, and what it doesn't have that the Scottish transition practice has is really that focus on assets and strengths, really up front. And this idea of rights-based, inclusive transitions. So I said, hey, I'm in Scotland. I'll take a look at this one. I'm not going to spill any of the secrets. You have to come back tomorrow for that. So the context is one early childhood center. We call them CPEs, Centre de la Petite Enfance in French. So they're publicly funded. They're parapublic actually, because they're run by a board, which is mostly made up of parents who attend the center, but they're funded by the government and they're regulated by the government. It's a wonderful system. They're also really affordable, except that there's not enough spaces in them. So there are only about 60% of children have access to these public early childhood education centers. So in one of these centers, there's what we call a double group, because there's 2 educators with 20 children, and the children are 4 and 5. So Most of them are going to start school the following year. Some of them still have another year before they start school. There were 2 educators in the group who also participated in the research project. And there were, so the transition practice that the mother put into place, because she was disappointed, her child was in that same group the year before, but he was maybe him and one other child were not going to school, and the other 18 were going to school. And they had a graduation ceremony, and he wasn't allowed to attend because he wasn't going to school the next year. And she was really upset. She felt like he was excluded. That's the subject of another presentation of how she ended up organizing this transition practice. But she felt like, why, even if it was him, what is the point of him putting on this fancy little hat and getting a diploma and singing a song? That's not marking his transition or helping him to prepare for school. I want to do something about it. So she was a bit of an exceptional parent, because despite the barriers that you talked about and the lack of invitation and openness, she really worked hard to convince the educators and the director to let her do this. And she took a lot of initiative. She made contact. She worked with the educators, actually, so it was a nice project in the end. She found out where the children who were in the group this year were going to school, and then, because she knew the parents from the year before, contacted all the parents and said who would be interested in participating of children who were in this, who had already started school. And she found 4 parents of children who were willing to participate and 4 children who were willing to go into school, to their school, and take photographs of their classroom or their school, and then come back into the childcare center during a PD day, and present the photos to their parents. So the idea was to their peers, to the children who would be starting, not to the parents, to the children who would be starting school the next year. And the idea was to create this sort of informal network amongst the children. And then I, as a researcher, would videotape this discussion amongst the children, and then play the videotape to the parents, who would then talk to each other. Both parents who were in school, who had children in school, and parents whose children would be starting school. Of course, what I wanted to do was have a separate mother and father group, but I got one father who was willing to do it and 4 mothers. So out of more than 20 children, because it was also the parents from the year before, I didn't have that much uptake. So that's the project. This was an intrinsic case study looking at the idea of mapping transitions, maps in the sense that I was mapping the findings onto the conceptual framework. And there were the photos taken by the children, the video of the children sharing the photos, the audio recording of the parent meeting, when we would press pause in the video. So the instructions were, I show the video, whenever you want to stop and ask questions and talk, you just signal and I press pause. And I didn't ask any questions, I just audio recorded the thing. And they talked to each other and asked each other questions. It was very interesting. Then there were individual interviews with each of the 2 educators, and there were 2 interviews with the mom who had organized the project. And so this is what my maps look like. You can't read anything, which is perfect because, like I said, I didn't want to divulge any of the information. But basically what I did, what's in blue are the different elements of the Scottish transition position statement, and what's in black is my data and 2 photos trying to map. And you can see that there are lots of areas that are empty, both because I'm not finished, but also because there are lots of areas that don't get touched on. So if we look at the different groups of participants, we had the children from kindergarten who chose to share photos that represent both continuity and change. So in terms of continuity, toys, the idea of play, specifically the same toys that were in the childcare and the childcare center and at the school, snack time, the cubbies, these were things that they took pictures of and that they presented. In terms of change, routines. So there were a lot of photos of the rules that were in pictogram form on the wall, or the way that they presented their photos made it clear that what's really important is that you raise your hand before you talk, or that you don't run, or that there were systems in place. This is the system with the lights, with not the lights, but the colors of the traffic light, the red and the yellow and the green. I don't know if you have this in your kindergartens, but basically it's, or your nursery classes or primary one, where it's on the wall and there's a chart and every child starts off the day in the green and then moves to the yellow if they get a warning, and they can move back to the green or they can move to the red, and then there's a consequence. This was a big deal. Also, different elements of space that there is no space. They're in different things that there are physical locations or objects that aren't in the childcare center, like the gym, the library, the computer lab, and the smart board were prominent in the photos. Also, relationships seemed to be important, but strangely enough, these children didn't talk so much about friends or friendships, but they did take a lot of pictures of themselves, adults, so teachers or the school-based childcare educator, other adults in the school, the secretary, and one boy took photos. His photos were really just children's faces. There were about 17 of them. And he said that these are the children, I want the children who are coming into my school to know that these are the friendly faces. So there were like maybe 2 children that he excluded. These were the ones you don't want, but these are the nice kids. If you need some help or you need to know who to talk to, go to these children. So that was really interesting. And children also manipulated the research context to get access to spaces that were normally prohibited. So there were pictures of one little girl, she's sitting at the teacher's desk, and she presents this, and the educator says, "Oh, is this, an important part of your day?" She goes, No, I'm never allowed to go there, but I was allowed for the photo. So when we talk about children's voices, I'm interested in that. As in terms of the children who hadn't started school yet, during when the photos were presented and the educators asked them to ask questions they were used to the script of the circle time where they share what they did on the weekend. So most of the topics were about the Easter egg hunt, that it had just recently been Easter over the weekend. And a couple of children asked questions or mentioned things about school. Often they would share something if they had an older sibling who was at school. There wasn't a lot of dialogue with the children or directly with with regards to the photos or asking about school to the kids who had come back. And according to the educators who I met with again, the individual interviews took place a week later. So I asked them, did the children respond? Did they play school? Did they do anything? And they said no. Once the older children left, it was like they had forgotten about it. But the educators took out the photos again because they knew they were meeting with me and they wanted to know what the children thought. So instead of going in and asking them myself, because I didn't have a relationship with them and it was a one-time thing, the educators took out the photos over 2 days, left them out, and then asked the children what they thought about school, if they remembered anything from the visit, what they were looking forward to, what they weren't. And what they said, they mentioned the toys, especially when the toys were the same as they had at the daycare. So the igloo, construction toys, the fact that they were allowed to bring board games from home, Barbie dolls, colored pencils, Lego, and there was one photo of the dinosaur photo in dinosaur books. So these are things that interested the children. The fact that you need to follow the rules that they got. The educators were like, I guess they think they don't have to follow the rules here. We'll come back to the rules. The fact that they could eat in the class, they were reassured. They were also reassured that they had toilets at school, and also impressed or interested because in the childcare center, there's just toilets. But at the school, there's a girl's toilet and a boy's toilet. 5 minutes. Okay. And one little boy said he was excited to be going to school because his older brother was already there. So the attempt to create social support in the moment didn't really work. It'd be interesting to see whether once the children started school, if they still maintained contact with children from their childcare center that they recognized. But I don't have that information. And then when the mothers were watching the video, that worked really well. They shared their concerns and experiences. One of the mothers, her child was already in school. One of the mothers had children who were still in the childcare center, and the other two had both children in the childcare center and children already at school. So they reassured each other, and they had a long discussion about the behavior management system with the colors, like I told you. They said that the teachers are too strict, and the teachers tell them that it's because there's too many children in the class. So in general, our classrooms have about 22 max children. They said that their children don't react well to the reward system. So they were saying that the older teachers just had rules and they were very strict. The younger teachers used these reward systems so you would get something if you were good. And then they found that their children only behaved appropriately to get the reward, and they were not happy with that. What they didn't like was that it was on the wall. So they could come home and they would say, well, Matthew, he's in the red every day. And then he becomes stigmatized. And they compared it to when their children were younger in the childcare center and they would get bitten. And the educators would not tell the parents who bit the children because they didn't want children to get stigmatized. So there was this care to protect the children, and they felt like it was dangerous having this chart up in the open. The only element in all this of the idea of children being competent came from one mother who said, children have common sense. I don't want my son to be safe only because he's going to get a reward for it. He knows, he should figure that out. But in general, the idea of competence, children who are competent, children who have rights, not mentioned at all. And what I did find out was that there were things happening outside of this project that parents were involved in, where some mother from one of the schools had started a Facebook group for all the parents entering at this particular school with children coming into kindergarten. So they would meet over the summer at different parks and have their children play together to get the children used to it, to create this community amongst themselves. And that was kind of exciting for me because it was parents organizing it on their own, taking initiative and being agents. The educators and the parents ensured that, so they made sure that to make the connections between the children who were invited to come and share photos, attended a school where there was going to be a child attending a school the next year. They facilitated the children's presentation. So they were the ones who would draw attention to, oh, it's like that, but how is it in the daycare center? Is it different? What's different? What's the same? Here we call it the song circle, but at school it's called circle time, things like that. So to help the children understand what was the same and what was different. They said they really enjoy it when the big children come back. And they like the activity because the young ones, most of them were very interested. And then I said, oh, you're going to do it again. And they said, oh, we'll take out the same pictures next year. So that was interesting too, because the mother played a huge role in contacting the parents and getting everything organized. And they liked it, but they weren't going to replicate it without help. They said that they try not to talk about school until after the winter holidays, and then they focus on autonomy, so toileting, getting dressed. They give them Ziploc bags and Tupperware containers to play with in the sand table to help them prepare for lunch. But they try not to stress them out. And in the spring, they play school bus, lunchbox games to help them. And they really want to focus on helping the children learn to stand up for themselves in school, which was different than what they'd said, parents' concerns. Parents would come and ask about, can the child write their name? Does the child know all the letters? And then they tell the parents, no, your child doesn't need to do those things. That's what they'll learn in kindergarten. They explained to parents, so that at the beginning of the childcare, they emphasize why they learn through play and the importance of the daily routine, so that they're not about preparing the children for school in a formal academic way. And then they said that many children come back to visit, both spontaneously, the older siblings of children who are still there, and when they come, they'll hook them in. They'll say, "Oh, come, tell the children who are here about school." And then those children always talk about the rules, they said. But they also said that children continue to visit over the years, so that once they had a child who was now an adult who was attending university, who came back because he was passing by on his way to the university. They often have high school placement. They have to do volunteer placements in the high school, and they'll often choose their childcare center to come back to. So that whole idea of a sense of belonging lasts a long time. They said they prepare memory books for children who are leaving for school, and when they see the parents again, specifically parents of siblings, they'll ask about the transition and how it's going, and sometimes it goes well, sometimes the children cry. And so, like I said, there were a lot of things that are in your beautiful transition statement, policy statement, that were not in my findings. Recognition of prior learning, like we saw in New Zealand, not a part of the discussion or the discourse that I can see in Quebec, unfortunately. This desire to support children and extend their learning, not so much, a little bit from the educators, but not coming from the teachers from what we saw. And the mothers would say, oh yeah, kindergarten, the real learning happens in grade 1. In kindergarten, it's about learning how to behave in society, and that justifies the public nature of these behavior charts. And this concept of the ratio and having too many children in the class, so that justifies this idea of not knowing the children and not taking the time to know the individual children, although the parents did talk about this one practice called the friend of the day, where one child is like at the front of the line and gets to do the calendar routine and also gets to talk a little bit about himself, and that's the one, I guess, once every month when the child gets a little bit of individual attention from the teacher. That's the way it came across in the discussions. There wasn't really collaboration between the sectors, except through the way that the mother kept in touch with the other families. And like we heard here, that idea of meaningful parental contribution, yes, the mother who organized this activity and worked really hard to do it was a particular case, but in terms of the way that the parents saw the school, their role was really to do what they were told. How am I doing for time? 5 more minutes? I'm out of time, so I won't discuss anything. I'll stop there.
Joanne, thank you very much.